Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of Enterprise Alchemy. As always, I'm Ant. Today, I'm joined by Rupert Brown. Rupert, thanks for taking the time with us today.
Pleasure, Ant.
Now, let's get straight to it. You've been a high-level executive at a lot of different places. Most recently, Virgin Media O2, I believe. So you've had such kind of a diverse, like you've been around the world, done all of this kind of stuff. Looking back on the career, right, as a whole, just to get us started, has it been plain sailing?
Has it been plain sailing? I'd say probably not plain sailing, but certainly it's been full of adventure and challenge.
Okay, yeah.
And I was reflecting a little bit about the serendipity sometimes that we have to acknowledge in our career and how it goes. Sometimes you think you're driving your career, which is certainly true at the earlier stage when I knew I wanted to be in human resources.
Right.
I knew I wanted to be international. I knew I wanted to be in the commercial sort of side of business,
Yep.
going through change, and was able to do deliberate actions in my career that moved me in the right direction. And other times when you're a passenger, especially when you're on that sort of international expat train,
Right, yeah.
because all assignments have an end date, often undetermined, but they have an end date of sorts. And where you're going next is usually the topic conversation when you're walking the dog with the wife. It's like,
right,
would you go there? Would you go there? But of course, you don't know until you get the call, and then you find out what's really happening. And then there's also times when you're almost a better metaphor is that of the hitchhiker. You might find yourself high and dry, and you're looking for the next ride. And I found that particularly in my career when I sort of left corporate and went into the private equity world, where things change really fast. You think you're going in for a project to do a scale up, build out, maybe an acquisition. Maybe there's something very specific in mind. And within a matter of months, that can turn, full 180, and actually you're shutting the thing down. And if you're doing that internationally, you can find yourself, as I did on a couple of occasions, overseas, away from home, no right to remain. Kids in school, a wife who doesn't know where to go next.
Right.
And hitchhiking is actually the best analogy there, because you're thinking, right, I've got a finite period of time here to sort of get out of Dodge and do something that's value adding to my career. I think serendipity is important, because sometimes it's the random conversations and saying yes to, hey, do you fancy meeting my boss? Do you fancy doing this? Do you fancy doing that? It's when you say yes to those things that actually the opportunities come up. So some people say, hey, you've pieced together a really nice career there. And I said, I have, but I also need to acknowledge there was a moment of serendipity in many of the moves.
Yeah.
And it'd be wrong to say that I planned it that way.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. But I think that's, like you said, it would be easy from the outside if you wanted to kind of veneer it and say, oh, yes, 100%. It's all intentional. But the thing I have noticed, so I've interviewed and talked with a lot of various roles, right? But successful people who've kind of grown through that ladder. And one of the things that seems to come up a lot is their willingness to say yes to stuff, or their willingness even just to ask questions. And this is something that I was reminded of the other day. So I was talking to one of our guests we had on not that long ago, and I asked him a question. I said, look, I hope you don't mind, but I was just wondering. And he said, and he's kind of quite American in his way, but he's like, and the answer to 100% of the questions you don't ask is no.
That's lovely.
Yeah.
That's brilliant.
Yeah, all right. So go ahead.
Yeah.
So I think, whilst I totally get that whole serendipity angle, right? It sounds like you're open, right? And willing to say, okay, let's talk.
Yeah, I have a joke with one of my favorite ex-bosses, who's now a mentor,
right?
And we both have a similar outlook on life. We both say yes to a lot of conversations, and we joke about those situations we find ourselves in. It's like, why did I get on that airplane to go to this country to talk to that guy about that business? What am I doing here? Can I stop saying yes? But of course you can't, because if you're leading with curiosity, you feel, well, I've got to find out a little bit more before I can make a decision.
Yeah.
And then you'd be surprised actually what options you do have in front of you. So I'm guilty of being too curious.
Yeah, but I think that's a great lesson. I mean, people say it and kind of use different phrases or words to describe it, but it's the moment that kind of curiosity dies, you're killing off potential avenues of opportunity, right? Not everything's going to work out, but if you don't explore them, you'll never know.
Yeah. I think for me, it was a very conscious decision actually to leave the comfort zone. I remember it very profoundly. It was I got my 10-year service award,
right?
Procter and Gamble, and I'd already done a couple of trips with them. They sent me to Switzerland and then to Singapore and then back to the UK.
Right.
I was not at peace with the decision to be back in the UK at that time. I felt like I still needed to be an international exec and sort of becoming a bit of a global citizen. So I was there, against my will. And when I got this 10-year service award, it just sort of dawned on me, hey, that was never the plan.
Right.
Getting tenure in a prestigious organization, whilst a great option for many people, for me, it was killing my soul.
Right.
And when I quit P&G, people were like, I cannot believe you're leaving that tenure on the table. That's halfway towards your pension or your severance check. And I said, no, I've got to find adventure and excitement, because I recognize all these great skills that you've been taught about how to work with people and get remarkable things done. To then not do something with it just felt like the biggest waste.
It's so how these dynamics are changing even over a generation, right? Like, let's say you went back to people who were doing this in the 80s and 90s and stuff like that, right? Who were at this career point, and there was still that you work at the one company, you work your way up, right? And to do anything else was kind of foolish, right? In not necessarily saying it was a foolish decision, but to say in the eyes of society is like, wow, man, it's crazy there. How things have changed, but I think that also your evidence, right, that you don't have to do that. You don't have to do the 20 years to get to those positions. And this is something I'm keen to get into a little bit. I'm sure your ability to learn lessons across geographies, across industries, across different types of ownership structures, like you said, like PE versus say like a PLC, they're different. Versus, let's say like a venture capital or like an owner, entrepreneur kind of led business. So from the change perspective, right? So it strikes me, and I may be wrong here, right? Because we don't know each other that well. But you're somebody who likes unpicking gnarly problems and likes to be mentally occupied with stuff, as in just kind of a BAU job, it seems.
Correct.
Is not necessarily the thing that lights you on fire.
Correct. I mean, in many ways, they're great places to start your career and, learn the building blocks and the tools and the skills. But when you're talking about actually doing something with your life, with your work, then I'm always a sucker for the next challenge.
Right.
And I was the first one who would say, look, I'm more interested in, the turnaround or the startup or the shutdown. Or the merger than I am in the just keep the lights, the lights on.
Right.
But of course, the economic environment plays a big role in that. So if I think about when I came back to the UK, it was, post financial crisis, and any large company was just happy to be positive on the growth numbers.
Right.
Yeah. So if I was growing at 1%, I was probably quite happy.
Right. At least it's not negative. Or
exactly.
Nothing. Right,
just keep the wolves at bay. But of course, that doesn't make for a very interesting environment. And I think what has changed more recently is because for a long time, the big conglomerates were the source of growth.
Yeah.
And when you're in a big organization that is growing and becoming even bigger, the opportunities are endless. So I can totally see how someone has done 25, 30 years in one big company and will feel like they've seen the world and seen many different business models and scenarios. The issue is when they stop growing. and essentially there's a bottleneck of talent and not enough opportunities.
Right.
And that's when your choice is: do I wait and hang it out because I like the security and the people, or do I go looking to try and make something happen myself?
Right.
And that's where I got to. So it's, in many ways, I have a lot to thank for the large corporates for what they gave me, but it was at a time when things were slowing down, and that growth just wasn't there.
Yeah. That's an interesting. I think it's a very interesting point, right? And even I've found the conglomerate approach, right? Of, well, that's how we're going to grow. We're going to bolt things together. Right. Like a good example, let's say, would be someone like GE, right? Where they're like, we're going to bolt things that are unrelated. And for a while, it sort of seems like it works. And then after a while, it's like, well, actually, no, because you kind of need people who know those businesses well enough to just focus the energies on that. And when it's too spread too thin, the very top decision makers, it's very hard to understand how to allocate capital and resources efficiently across those.
And the pendulum keeps swinging, doesn't it? You go towards conglomerate, you go away from it, and also
it's probably a fair point. If we're having this conversation in 20 years' time, we'd probably be saying, "Oh, this is the new thing." Yeah.
Well, I've seen both. So my times in the shipping conglomerate AP Moller Maersk, which was a group structure when I first joined. They were deliberately moving out of their oil and gas assets, which were proving unpopular and less profitable, and they wanted to be essentially a consolidator all around the logistics.
Okay.
So not just a shipping company, but also ports, terminals, warehousing, trucking.
Okay. More vertical integration.
Exactly. Yeah. So you get that shift to the vertical integration. But actually, when you peel the onion on the inside, it still can feel conglomerate, if you like. So different business units have a different style and a different play. But your question earlier was around the international aspects of it, and I think what I've enjoyed, 15 years outside of my home country, across 6 different assignments across Asia and the Middle East and Europe. Everything's different. And I think actually if you fly at a sort of quite a high level and you look at business strategy and business challenges, things look really similar.
Right.
When you get a bit closer to the ground, you realize it's the differences that matter. And that's especially true of how leadership shows up, how people have respect of leadership, how change comes about, and how you can actually get this stuff done on the ground is very, very different.
Right. So this is something I actually really wanted to ask you about. And I was talking with a COO the other day, a part of, well, they were the world's largest law firm. So one of her big specialties as well was this kind of change process, right? And we talked about the importance of nuance, and that you have to understand your operating environment. And so I just wanted to kind of pick up on that. And like you said, and this is where I think, oops, sorry guys, there could be a bit of a disconnect where, like you said, if you fly at the 1,000-foot level, you're like, well, there's numbers. We got to make stuff, presumably, sell stuff, make a profit, do all these things. But when it comes to the actual places where the work is getting done, these things can look very, very different.
Yeah.
So like you said, how the leadership shows up every day, how things get done, the operating rhythm. So how do you, being somebody who's had vast experience on the global stage, how do you, if you're coming into an assignment like that, right? How do you start to think about it? How do you get in touch with that? What's your process for thinking about where do I start with that kind of a change?
Yeah. Well, I've always, maybe I grew up in the age of globalization, where your first response to most overseas problems was get on a plane and go and find out. But that's still, my first response is time spent on the ground with people who understand it better than you is the answer. Now, I appreciate today we probably travel a lot less and we get on more phone calls.
Yeah.
But we miss nuance, and we don't build relationships as well if we do that. So I'm still very much a believer of, you've got to get out there, you've got to spend time in the trenches. Because one of the jobs of leadership is to relate to the people that you're working with. Yeah. You're not driving change alone, right? Yeah. So it's incredibly important that you do that and understand the differences between the different styles of leadership that you might have, and it's way beyond national or cultural sort of lines. Each leader shows up differently, has their own challenges, has their own strengths, and I'm reminded of some of the. I think one of the best roles in an organization for development are the regional roles, where you're sort of you're spanning multiple geographies, and you're also feeding back to head office, if you like, because that's when you really appreciate the breadth of difference across different cultures. And I'm often reminded of when I was in Southeast Asia, we had one particular market was outperforming the others year after year. And it was the only market where we had local leadership in place rather than relying on an expat.
Okay.
And it was Vietnam that was the outperforming market. And most other companies would say, we understand Vietnam is a hotspot, it's a growth market, but it's not one of our best performing markets. What's the secret? What are you guys doing? And it all came down to the organization. And what was very unique about that organization was whenever you went to travel there, all they wanted to talk to you about was development. It was all about careers, skills, and development. It wasn't about, can I have some more money? Can I have bigger budgets? Can I get promoted? It was purely a development conversation. And myself and the CEO would spend all our time promoting, listening to, and nurturing talent. And that just became, it was the extraordinary lever to be able to get stuff done in a market that many companies struggled in. And I always thought to myself, that was the secret sauce. If we can get that kind of culture.
And I think, and myself, like this is something I can relate to being an Aussie, basically, because we're quite close to Southeast Asia. And it's interesting, you see from the American view, even sometimes like the European view, right? Southeast Asia. So it sounds like it's just a homogenous place, right?
Couldn't be further from the truth.
Yeah.
Right?
And you go, there's ancient cultures there, very, very different from each other. The nations, it's like saying, well, it's just Europe.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, yeah, they're very, very different places, countries with their own histories, their own ways of doing things. But the interesting thing to me that you mentioned is it goes beyond just that, like that might be an easy way of writing it off and saying, if you stopped at that level and say, okay, it's culturally different, right? But the piece underneath that, it sounds like you actually took the time to understand how is work getting done and how do we support them rather than trying to parachute in, right, your own leadership, which might be more familiar to you because I've worked with this person, they can go and lead that.
Yeah.
Right? And one of the examples that has come to my mind on this, which I thought is a real good example of how not to do this. So Bunnings in Australia is, like the home handy.
Yeah, familiar.
Yeah. So then they came over here and bought a big business and brought in, I think, their top 100, right?
Really?
Execs, management team, something like that. And it ended up costing them billions, right, to do this. And a friend of mine who works for a distressed debt company,
right? Yeah,
did a deal with them. Or their organisation did a deal with them to buy it for £1,
right?
After they'd blown up billions, and then ended up turning around and selling it again. Yeah. And the thing that was so interesting to me, right, is he made a comment to me one night. We were having a couple of beers, and he goes, "Do you want a swimming pool?" And I was like, "What do you mean? Do I want a swimming pool?" And he goes, "Mate, we got 50 of these things. They're like 20 grand each. They've bought them in to stock because, like in Oz, it's popular.
Oh, really?
So we've got a bunch of these things sitting there, and nobody's buying them." And I'm like, "Well, first of all, it's not summer. Second of all, how many people are going to want to buy a 20 grand above ground pool?"
Yeah, not right.
Money. And to me, the thing that really, the penny that dropped there, and if you've been living in the UK for a while, you go, that's a terrible idea. That's not stock you want to buy.
Right.
But for someone who's not familiar, right, with the market and how things operate and the economics here, it's, oh, well, that's how it's done in Oz, so we will do
Well,
that.
it would have been convenient if it was true, right? So I guess if you're sat in a load of swimming pools and you got one supply you want to use again, it'd be lovely if you could sell them in the UK, but no one's buying. So
yeah, right. So that thing really, and I was like, surely that would be obvious to someone, but it just goes to show it's kind of like this disconnection, right, from what's happening on the ground. So I'm interested in what you were talking about providing support and development to where the work's getting done,
right,
and building them and giving what they need to do things rather than trying to impose. And whether that's from a cultural perspective, you know what I mean, or whatever, it's more these people have the experience. So why is it that sort of I'm just curious from your years of experience in this, why is it that trust is it well, I should go back a step. Is it a trust issue, or like why do they want to parachute people in rather than support the local?
I think there's and sometimes it works, right? Sometimes the route to international growth is by sending out your best and your most trusted. In fact, that's a model that works particularly well in the Maersk days. And just so happened, a lot of the Danish leaders have a particular style about them that is very easy to warm to, and it makes for a very successful model. Right. The most diverse teams obviously have just have an appreciation of difference in them. And I think what you're missing when you do that is essentially you're going for the cookie cutter approach. This has worked a few times before, so I will try it again. What I've noticed working for entrepreneurs, as an example, rather than corporate folks, is just how different they think,
right,
and what they value and what they respect. And many an entrepreneur will not value the opinion of a corporate person because they don't feel that you've put yourself at risk the extent that they have. They really have mortgaged the house on an idea and they've worked until it came good. And I think actually, if you're quick to judge, you might say, yeah, but you haven't got the skills. You're not as silky as the corporate guys.
Yeah.
You haven't got the degrees or whatever it might be. But actually, when you look at the results, the outcome, and what they are able to achieve, you realize there's stuff that they can do that you just can't do in a corporate machine. So the beauty is a group of people who have a bit of both, who can get along and get some amazing stuff done. And I found that actually, sometimes, whilst it's not easy to do, when you do acquire businesses and keep the founders around, they have super strengths.
Right.
And the challenge, of course, is trying to get that out of them once you've already made them billionaire, so billionaire. So it's like, okay, how now do we get to work together? But I think it's about appreciating other people's strengths, because if you think of the leadership as just one approach, especially when you're thinking of global expansion, I don't think you're gonna, necessarily, unless you've got the killer product.
I
mean, there's always exceptions, right? But I just think you have to put an awful lot of machinery around it to make it work, to compensate for its lack of diversity.
Yeah, I find that's an interesting thing, is the things that we want to do, like, because mentally or theoretically it's easy, right? Oh, we'll replicate this process, because it would be too hard to do something where we have to build a localized, nuanced process, except you finally get to the point where you go, oh shit, we should have done that in the first place, because that's what works.
Yeah, and often that's what when you go in and you look at a small collection of businesses and you're looking at opportunities, usually you're wearing the standardization glasses, right? And you're thinking, why do we do that 5 different ways? Let's just do it once. And if you're not, you end up sort of throwing the value out of the window. Right. In the spirit of just trying to standardize, if you're not careful. But there are other things where you do need to approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's undeniable benefits.
Yeah.
But for me, it's kind of, speaking to successful global leaders like yourself and others I've spoken to, it's this theme that keeps coming up. The ones who have done it for a while and done it well and achieved stuff, is this real appreciation for it's nuanced. Yeah. You can't, yes, you might have an overarching kind of idea, but when you get down to the actual, we have to implement this and organize how the work gets done, we need to have an appreciation for the specifics of the environment in which we find ourselves.
Yeah, I think I've become much more tolerant of the differences, and recognizing actually you got to, be choiceful in where you choose to focus on standardization, for example. Make it's got to mean something and be meaningful to be worth worth the aggro. Otherwise, just live with the fact it's different. It's probably different for a reason.
Yeah. Okay. That's good advice. So sort of switching gears a little bit, but moving more to, I suppose, let's say the HR world more broadly. What are the sort of things you're seeing in terms of, let's call it trends, and wherever you want to go with this. So whether it's HR operating models or certain strategy or certain things that might be hot button topics or issues, from that large global view, what are the things that you're seeing?
So, I mean, it's really about our approach to change and transformation is the big trend that I'm seeing, and just I guess the acknowledgement that it's here to stay and it's business as usual. So historically we talked about change and transformation when it was like a business event,
right?
A merger, acquisition, a sale, or whatever it is.
Okay.
But now effectively it relates just about everything, accommodating market dynamics, implementing technology, just staying competitive, staying in the game. And I think for a long time, we sort of thought of change management and the leadership of change as something discrete, specialized, and a bit sort of further down the organization.
Yeah. You have a change manager.
Yeah, exactly, right. So it's a department that does a lot of data gathering and Excel generation. But actually, it's becoming much more a style of leadership. And often it might be called a people-centric approach to change, just because it's just everywhere and permanent. And the difference between able to sort of cope with more is the ability to be able to lead people in those difficult times.
So this is one of the things I'd like to get your thoughts on. I think you just touched on it there. I've always found this in my own mind a little confusing, right? Like, so they say, so change in the corporate sense is talked about as if, like you said, it's a discrete event,
right?
And then I look out to the world, and sometimes I kind of do this: is just go out left field and go, okay, let's observe biology, for example.
Right.
It never stands still, right? Everything's always adapting and evolving.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
This whole thing of like, change is not a discrete event. Change is the system in which we find ourselves. You always need to be, because if you don't adapt and evolve, right, you die eventually. Might take a while, but that's kind of eventually where it gets to. So, is that something you would agree with, first of all? And then I've got another little question.
Well, I mean, there is certainly an evolutionary sort of angle to what we're all going through with technology and sort of global events. But I think in organizations it is different in that you're switching things on and off,
right?
At different levels and simultaneously. So it's almost like if you don't approach it as essentially a discrete activity, you can't explain to people what's going on.
Okay,
why last week did you use that system and next week you use this one, all the way up to we need to change from being a product business to a service business or whatever it might be. So I think that it runs a risk of it sounding like it's on and then it's off again, when in fact it is constant. But in a way, you're trying to direct attention towards something that requires attention now because it is changing.
All right. So I think thank you for, that. I think that's a really insightful kind of nuance that the evolution, like you said, if it's just constant, then it almost, in a way, what I'm hearing, which I really agree with, is that then it de-emphasizes possibly the need to communicate, right? That we're, like you said, we're moving from this system to this system, right? So yes, these things will be happening, but at the same time, the communication component and people understanding why that's happening is absolutely critical to them going, oh God, not just another.
Well, I mean, that is the eye rolling and the tutting is a natural consequence. And I think it's important that's where you meet people, is to say, we know how this feels. It doesn't feel great. And it's about creating the space to actually have that conversation, to be able to do something with it.
So a follow-up then, and this is something you mentioned, because this is certainly something I've seen and spoken to, over the years, where somebody said, well, I'm a change manager, right? And the thing that always seemed, it's not necessarily strange, but it just did make me curious. I'm like, you could have subject matter expertise in how to execute that process, but somebody in a lower mid-level position in a shared services function is possibly not the best person to be that chain, like certainly to advise,
right?
You know what I mean? But that's not the person who's necessarily going to lead that. That's a leadership question that needs to be owned by the the main lines of business. So how do you, first of all, like, kind of how do you see that? And then I know you did talk about, well, this is leadership getting involved in the change, and so the second part of the question, I suppose, is what implications does it have for HR structure and leadership and how things then get done?
Yeah. Well, I love the fact that you picked up on this, because I think it's very true that a lot of the sort of change activities are, delegated and essentially put, it's seen as a set of activities as opposed to a leadership responsibility.
Yeah.
And I think the problem is because there's just so much detail, right? So it's like I can't get my head around all the moving parts if we're going to rip out the core IT system. So let's get a team of experts who will be really analytical, data focused, and know their onions, and they can map it out. And then me as the leader, I say that's just one of my many change activities, and I can't quite get my head around what it means for people. And that is the leadership dilemma, which is there is so many things moving simultaneously.
Right.
It's easier just to sort of gloss over it and put it down to, we just need to get it done, suck it up, guys. But the reality is a lot is changing for a lot of people.
Yeah.
It creates a lot of energy, a lot of emotional energy that's not positive.
Yeah.
And you need to recognize it to be able to direct it. Otherwise we go nowhere. People often the straw that breaks the camel's back can be something minute. It could be like, how do I get into the building? You've changed the ID badge system.
Yeah.
Or how do I change my password? It's like a small thing, but it's the thing that sends people over the edge, right? And it's just, I think of these different change programs a bit like planes stacked up above Heathrow Airport trying to come into land. When you look up in the sky, you see 4 planes. It's not the first time that day there's been 4 planes waiting to land. They've been there all day, most of the night, and they just keep one after the other. And that's the individual experience of change.
Yeah.
Here comes another one.
That's a really good analogy. Yeah.
So I think we need to meet people where they are and appreciate that, because there needs to be some space to be able to deal with it and cope with it if we are going to evolve and move forward.
So here's a question then on that. I just thought of this and I was like, I'm interested in your views on this. So then, is change, like, let's say this change fatigue.
Yeah.
Right. The planes coming in, and I get it. And there was something else I was triggered off about. If it's difficult for a leader, right, to go, I can't get my head around this, and you don't have to work with it day to day. Imagine how it is for the poor sod who's like, oh, now I have to learn this whole new thing, and it doesn't work the way I wanted, and all the rest of it. So the question I wanted to get your thoughts on is change fatigue then a lack of prioritization, right, at the top, or it's just necessary because all these things have to be done?
Yeah, both, I would say.
Okay.
The prioritization question is a good one, because what you often find is, the change transformation are overused terms for sure. But part of that is because there's just activity happening at all levels. So the company might be going through something quite profound.
Okay, right.
But at the same time,
there's lots of stuff that needs to get done.
But at the same time, almost independent of that, each of the functional leaders is trying to get ahead of the curve. So you mentioned HR operating models earlier. Most strong HR leaders have one eye on what is the operating model for their function. They will also be thinking about, have they got the right talent, the right processes? They're doing all that stuff as well as trying to get ahead of what is the actual change required at the company level.
Okay,
and
right.
You're absolutely right to call out the guys a bit further down who are at the receiving end of multiple different leaders with their own great ideas, and of course a board, a CEO, and a lot of investors who actually want something much bigger.
Yeah, right.
So I think we've all got very limited bandwidth for this stuff.
Yeah. That's kind of where my mind goes. Right, is there's just mentally there's only so much you can cope with at any one point in time.
So don't chew it up with stuff that's nice to do rather than must do.
Yeah. Okay, so a couple of pieces then. as we kind of move towards the back end here. So one thing I'm curious about then, we talked about the HR operating model, you know, saying, okay, we got to think about how this change, we've got to be intentional, we've got to be prioritized. In terms of how HR teams are resourced and the function itself is resourced, do you see any major changes on the horizon in terms of the composition of skills that are needed to go forward and meet the challenges that we're seeing, you know, these kind of evolving challenges?
Yeah, but something that certainly I felt was quite profound coming out of COVID was if you like, the breadth of the people agenda just getting broader and broader. So if you think it was already playing a very strategic role in trying to get a lot of things done and get the right talent on board and so on, we then added on a well-being agenda, a diversity and inclusion agenda at sort of at warp speed. We now have this. Essentially, we've added places to work to the agenda as well, with the whole hybrid working and return to the office stuff. So you've got a massive breadth on the people agenda at a time when actually I think the attention is being diverted away from the big thing, which is what is the change transformation the company's trying to do. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the HR person, but somebody with a lens on people. And this, what we've been talking about, bandwidth for change and the skills that are required for the future. Somebody has to be dedicated on that piece, because that in a way is more important to the the success of the company longer term than a lot of the proliferation of the agendas in the last few years. So I'm always thinking, is it a time to sort of split the function a little bit and say you actually need the transformation responsibilities, not for the HR function, but for the company at large. That needs to be something that the chief people officer has full attention for, as well as everything else that the HR function used to do, almost like the operations of HR.
Yeah, like people ops type thing.
Like people ops. But that, do you know what I mean? So it's almost like you need to split the two things up. So one eye on transformation and one eye on running the HR function.
Never thought of that. But I think, there you go. I'll take that. I think that's a really insightful piece there, because it's, like you said, is one eye is to the future, and then it's kind of like we got to manage the status quo. But the thing is, when it comes to people, it's really complicated.
Right.
Like, it's not, you know what I mean?
I'm the look at your face says it all. Yeah, I know.
It's not like, oh, well, install this system and you can program it in these ways and it does these things. People are not, you can't put them in a box and predict, you can predict to a point, but it's so much more complicated than that.
That's why the HR transformation activities are so distracting. Right. When you start putting your people through change of their own or org redesign, you take so much bandwidth out of the organization.
Right.
It's like they need to be helping others, yet they're distracted by their own futures. So I think you need to be really careful about how much you do that, and the extent to which you